Nintendo has announced that it is planning to start releasing consoles officially in Indonesia. In this video, we're going to look through the news, we're going to look at the specific context of Indonesia, and then look more broadly at Nintendo's Southeast Asia plan, some of the hiccups they've experienced, and some of the things in particular with regard to Indonesia that they have had to do in order to secure this arrangement. We're going to look at some of the distribution obstacles that they may face in the Indonesian market, and then look at the long-term potential, including, of course, the often asked question of whether or not this will help or hinder Nintendo in getting past the 160 million threshold, which is, of course, the reported number of PlayStation 2 units that have been sold. So let's have a look specifically at the current news. We have a new Nintendo website, which is introducing Nintendo to Indonesia, and they are planning to sell both the Switch and the Switch 2. In a press announcement, the executive officer at Nintendo responsible for organising this, Juro Takeuchi, said, "We feel that this console is very suitable in Indonesia because of the characteristics of the game are suitable for Indonesian people who love their families and friends very much. Therefore, we hope that users can try directly and enjoy various types of games in various ways with the closest people." Now, I apologise that this is a little bit garbled because obviously it's from Japanese, I assume, into Indonesian and then filtered through Google Translate. So how closely that resembles the original statement, I don't know. But to give an idea of Indonesia's background, it is a place of 288 million people, over 17,000 islands split into 38 provinces. It's the fourth most populous nation in the world, and it is part of the ASEAN economic bloc of South Asian countries, which includes, of course, Singapore, where Nintendo have also set up a new subsidiary very recently. It's proximate to existing Nintendo territories, not just Singapore, but obviously Australia, which does give some advantages in terms of Nintendo being able to make arrangements from their existing territories. And while it's probably a coincidence, it is notable that it is the basis for the new Pokémon generation, and so there might be a particular appeal for Pokémon in that territory. Economic considerations we should take into account. The Indonesian currency, the rupiah, is actually one of the few currencies which is denominated in even larger numbers than the Japanese yen. There's about 140 rupiah to the yen off the top of my head. Indonesia is quite large in terms of GDP and other metrics, but of course it is a large country, and so once you adjust for that, if you look at the wealth per adult, it comes 105th between Namibia and Colombia. It also has the 67th mean wealth per adult between Botswana and Turkey in the rankings, and of course the difference between the median and the mean suggests that there is a concentration towards the top of more wealthy individuals, but even in that case, we have to say that the highest salaried area, Jakarta, has only an average wage of about $700, and while living costs might be lower, that's still a much lower wage than the price at which Nintendo are likely to want to sustain the sales of Switch and Switch 2. Having said that, there is an extensive middle class of more affluent people, and at the top 1%, which out of a big country is a significant number, there are people on average wages which are commensurate with middle wages in America and the West, and their diaspora estimated at 6 to 9 million plus people in 2023, which is likely to only grow. And so since there are many people who might in different countries get to know Nintendo products, it makes sense that there is a market and an inroad to expand for Nintendo in this territory. Now, Nintendo have been doing pretty well in recent years in terms of expanding into diverse territories. If we look at the other territory statistic from their reports over recent years, we can see that it used to be, going back to 2014 right at the bottom, that only about 2.9% of their annual sales came from other territories that's outside of Japan, the Americas, and Europe. Well, that has increased significantly. Now, the percentage on its own isn't necessarily hugely determinant because, of course, there are different factors that are coming into play, but you can see that the absolute numbers are increasing as well, with the major surge appearing to come during the pandemic and sustaining since, with 2026 being a particularly major year with the launch of Switch 2 in these territories. It's clear that Nintendo wants to carve out Asia as a fourth major part of their long-term business plan, and this will greatly help their expansion projects. However, how has it gone so far, and what are the obstacles that have been faced? In their Southeast Asian approach so far, they have set up a Philippines regional office. That was January 26. They also opened in Taiwan in February 25. They had Singapore in September 2025 and noted then that this was the aim of accelerating business in Southeast Asia. They had a Thailand regional office in November 2025, and they were advertising, in fact, in July 24 for a Thailand and Southeast Asia localization manager, which gives some indication of where they're planning to go with some of these titles. And they also have planned to enter India as of early 2027, linking probably to the removal of the Switch from the European market due to new regulations about batteries. And of course, there will be the Nintendo World at Universal Studios, which is currently planned to open, I believe, in 2030. Now, there have been Southeast Asian expansions in the past, particularly during the period where Nintendo last had some success during the mid-2000s with the DS and then the Wii. So we saw the 2005 opening of the Hong Kong branch, and they moved into Korea in 2006. So it feels like as of the mid-2000s, they possibly had to put on hold some of their expansion plans due to the contraction within the company, but they are now returning to what seems to be quite an extensive long-term plan. But why are they only entering Indonesia right now? Well, the first discussions between Indonesia and both Nintendo and the Pokémon Company started in March 2025, and that is sourced straight from the Indonesian government, ECRAF. The TKDN is a particular piece of domestic legislation which might have caused some issues for Nintendo. This is a legislation which requires a percentage of domestic contributions to products sold in Indonesia. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be that they are Indonesian-made components all the way through, but they're talking materials, labour, production processes, something along the way has to involve Indonesian labour. Now, it may not apply to Nintendo because there are many different rules and different issues. There are different categories and sector-specific requirements, but there are things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth which would affect Nintendo, and we've seen previous examples where companies have been snarled up with this kind of issue. So the most high profile of these cases is probably Apple. With Apple, I quote this article from January 2025, which noted that Indonesia requires 40% of parts, for Apple anyway, used in certain smartphones to be produced domestically, and to comply, Apple had pitched a $1 billion investment in a manufacturing facility on India's Batam Island to produce parts for the AirTag tracking device. Now, the regulation that was governing this, the TKDN regulation, called for locally produced components to be integral parts of a device, whether a smartphone, tablet or computer, and one of the analysts told the newspaper that ideally Apple would establish a factory in Indonesia where components can be produced domestically and included in the sales packaging of Apple devices. For instance, adapters, data cables, earphones, cases, and even simple components of the packaging and manuals have their own assessment weight. Basically, the AirTags themselves were not considered enough. Now, obviously, this is partly Indonesia playing hardball with a fairly significant company, but also it makes sense that for Nintendo trying to enter the market, they would also need to look very carefully at these regulations, and this probably accounts for why Indonesia lagged behind some of the other South Asian economies in being in Nintendo's priorities. Now, Indonesia's account of this is that Nintendo has agreed the following things. They have included a development kit for Indonesian game developers, which will allow access for Indonesian developers to the huge global market through the Switch and Switch 2. And we'll look at some specific issues where there have been limitations on the Indonesian game developers in the past. Also, the state news confirmed that they are building with Salim Group, who are the official distributors, an official repair centre and customer service centre, which obviously would require some investment. Now, they do talk about further cooperation, so talent development, knowledge sharing, involvement with developers, localization, and even IP development, but it is not in the sense of this is definitely happening, but they talk about this is something that can be expanded. So the precise quote says Nintendo's relationship with Indonesia is expected to develop beyond the product distribution aspect. Collaboration can be expanded through talent development, knowledge sharing, involvement with the developers, localization, creative collaboration to IP development. The synergy between technology and Nintendo's global experience with the diversity of local perspectives is expected to be an important momentum to strengthen Indonesia-Japan cooperation in the field of games. And that's straight from the Indonesian government, that's straight from ECRAF. Now, of course, they want to push this, but whether or not that is actually something Nintendo has at this point agreed to, the wording does not make fully clear, though I would expect that as part of this process, you would expect there to be ongoing commitments from Nintendo, ongoing insistence from Indonesia that they try to push Nintendo to be ever more involved, and so it is likely to happen. And in fact, there might be some reasons why it could be advantageous for Nintendo. So involvement with developers, well, if they're talking about subcontracting Indonesian talent, not necessarily whole game studios, but certain individual areas and aspects of game development, well, this is something that could be of quite good value to them. We've seen subcontractors such as Bandai Namco Studios Malaysia and CG Bot, who worked extensively on Metroid Prime Remastered, being significantly based in parts of the world which have lower wage employees, and this kind of subcontracting could be a benefit for Nintendo. There is the possibility of direct subcontracting for games. For example, Brandeville Studios was a Jakarta-based art and animation studio which worked on Assassin's Creed Shadows and The Last of Us Part 1, but it could be in terms of support for indie productions, and there are many significant indie productions which have come to Switch, including a game called Coffee Talk, and there is also the potential of subcontracting individuals. So, for example, for Nintendo Studios Singapore, they may find that it's advantageous to be able to hire in the Indonesian market, and we can see some examples of this previously. So, for example, Streamline Studios in Malaysia has hired directly from Indonesia, and Streamline Studios have worked on a number of Western games. Now, the benefits for Nintendo here are that the outsourcing could lead to cost reductions, of course, because they are part of the AISAAN. For Indonesia, it means that there are some issues already resolved, and this will be helpful to Nintendo as they build their base in Southeast Asia. And of course, having a strong distribution partner in the region will be incredibly helpful, given that there are many logistics to overcome. It also just broadens their resilience overall because they're not reliant on any one specific region. Even if this is quite a small region for them, it's at least better than nothing, and there may be other advantages that could come into play still. So in terms of Indonesian gaming, there is currently a big push to make this a bigger part of their future. So on the 8th of August, it was confirmed that Indonesia's National Game Day would be celebrated every year, this putting games into a bigger spotlight. Then in February 2024, we saw a presidential regulation which accelerated national game industry development, showing that it is a priority for Indonesia as they move forward into the future. And there have been games which have had rocky roads getting onto Switch. So, for example, Coral Island was due to be ported to Switch, but because of layoffs at publisher Humble Games, it meant that ultimately Coral Island was not able, so far as I can tell, to come to the Nintendo Switch, despite being by all accounts relatively successful for Indonesian games. Now, there are barriers which will continue to be in place for Nintendo in this region. For one thing, there are no current first-party games that are in Indonesian. All the localization will need to be done as new, and while Nintendo have quite a number of games that they could localize, that will obviously take some time and require some cost. The localization may also require some degree of cultural sensitivity because of the different location, but this might not be the end of the world and part of Nintendo's general process of understanding how to access different markets. There are also a lot of mobile games which could be used to target Indonesia because generally these mobile games are lower cost entry points for people interested in Nintendo content, but most of the big ones, including Fire Emblem Heroes, their biggest, and their newest, Pictonico, are not currently available in Indonesia. However, Niantic do seem to have the facility to enter Indonesia with Pikmin Bloom and Pokémon Go both available, and Indonesian Switch and Switch 2s have been available to some degree in this country, but they've actually been cheaper than other places in recent years. Possibly, it's been speculated, as a result of batch buying of stock and people underselling the MSRP in order to get sales in the region, but for whatever reason, it will help Nintendo if they can have their official presence and therefore limit this kind of activity. Also, we have seen some initiatives towards entry into the Indonesian market, or at least promotion of Indonesian concepts. So, for example, for Pokémon Go, there has been a specific party for Jakarta over the previous year, and although it's not an entry specifically into the market, note that Pikmin Bloom has had some kind of tropical journey paradise theme, which has specifically involved Balinese carving decor Pikmin making their debut, suggesting that they're at least trying to appeal to people in this market, and perhaps we will see a greater evidence of this pushing forward in the years to come. I think Shigeru Miyamoto recently noted how successful Pikmin Bloom was in Taiwan, so I suspect that they do see Pikmin as being a franchise which has a lot of potential to push into Asia, just as they've previously seen Metroid as being one that has quite a potential in the West. Long term then, well, a small percentage of Indonesia's population would still translate to millions of potential consumers, and of course there is quite an interest for pushing into these new markets. It only takes one hit to really launch them, and they have so many different properties that even one could spark big. Nintendo also like to build familiarity with their icons as part of their multi-generational strategy, and we heard this from Furukawa and Miyamoto at recent corporate events, where they're talking about how they view the option of bringing Nintendo to different people as something that will build from generation to generation. So even if people just have a broad familiarity now, in 20 or 30 years' time, that could translate to major sales. It also helps standardize Nintendo's distribution and stops people undercutting their international prices, and it gives them a more consistent presence across Southeast Asia, given that they are already moving into Thailand and other territories. It also means that as they look towards cultural adaptations specific for the Indonesian market, well, these might help other territories, particularly other Muslim majority territories such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Pakistan and Turkey. So it's not the worst thing in the world for them to put a lot of investment into trying to get this right in a smaller market first. The strategies they're using for lower wage markets such as India and Thailand will also cross over to the approach that they're making in Indonesia, so it's not like they're going to have to reinvent the wheel in terms of how to sell into a country which has a lower average wage, and this is something that they will continue to have to deal with as they expand. Now, I did say I'd talk quickly about the 160 million number, which has been bandied around. Sony, of course, has given no confirmed number of PlayStation 2 sales, but that is the expectation. And as of June 2026, we had 156.59 million units sold. Nintendo are predicting for this fiscal year 2 million to be sold. And of course, there is a low residual demand for the Switch, and it's not even going to be sold in Europe past February 2027. So I normally would think that it's going to run a little bit short. The usual expectation, I've said before, would be for older consoles to drop about 60% year on year once there is a replacement on the market, and that would normally take them below 1 million and then to about 100,000 the year after, which would not get them anywhere close. However, although I do expect this to be quite a minor part of their overall sales profile, it will obviously help a little bit, and there is the potential for Switch to break out in the region. There have been examples in the past of late-in-life consoles suddenly getting a massive resurgence, most notably perhaps in 1996, when the Game Boy was almost single-handedly revived by Pokémon Red and Green. And one potential option would be an ultralight model, a really cheap model. If they could bring something like that to market, well, maybe that could be determinant in changing Nintendo's fortunes. At any rate, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please do consider checking out the Patreon, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.